we're talking about books. I wore my Cult Book Club shirt, which I have worn way too much. Welcome back. We are halfway through the year, so I thought I'd do kind of a mid-year review of the books I've read so far. So I didn't have a plan for what I was going to read this year. I'm very much a fly by the seat of my pants reader, which is also why I kind of have a little bit of trouble with book clubs. I just don't like having a plan for what I'm going to read next. It feels like very I don't know, confining to me. I like to just read what I feel in the moment because I don't want to be biased against a book I'm reading just because I'm reading it when I don't feel like reading it. So all of these have just kind of come as I bought them. Usually what determines what I'm going to read next is I've either bought it recently or the movie's about to come out. So the film industry really does dictate a lot of what I end up reading at any given time. So the first book is called The Wild Inside by Christine Carbo. The story begins with the discovery of a body in Glacier National Park. It appears to be the victim of a grizzly bear attack, but on closer inspection, it shows that this was actually a well-constructed murder. The main character, Ted Sisted, is an investigator with the Department of the Interior, and he's assigned to investigate the case. This becomes difficult as we learn that he has a history with grizzly bear attacks in Glacier National Park. So this book has a really great premise. Not only is it a murder mystery, but it deals with a lot of really interesting topics, such as the influence of drugs in small towns, what determines if an animal is dangerous to humans, dealing with trauma and PTSD, the different degrees of morality of self-defense. However, all of these great themes fall flat with the execution of this novel. I see a lot of people describing it as a slow burn. To me, it seems like a toaster oven on the fritz. There's a little bit of excitement, then nothing for 5 chapters, then a tiny bit of excitement, then nothing. And I don't need action all the time, but Carbo literally describes like every single movement of the characters. I'm talking bathroom breaks, chewing food, things like that. It takes forever to make progress in this story. And then the payoff isn't that amazing because it took so long to get there. Like by the time I was getting to the end, I was like, just tell me who did it so I can be done. I gave this book a 1 out of 5 stars just because even though this book had really good ideas, the execution just kills the mood. The next book is The Wonder by Emma Donoghue. She wrote the novel Room, which you've probably seen the film with Brie Larson. I absolutely loved this book, so I was really excited to read something else by Donoghue. The Wonder follows Lib Ray. She is a nurse in 1859. She's called to a rural village in Ireland where it's rumored that this young girl has been surviving without food for many months. So a council from the village has called Lib to kind of keep watch over this girl to see if she is sneaking food or if she is a true miracle. Throughout the book, we find out more about Liv's past and see her transformation as she works to discover the truth about what's going on. There are a few things I really loved about this book. First, Liv's character development. She is a former war nurse trained under Florence Nightingale, so she has very definite ideas about science and health and how the human body works. She's also very headstrong and determined to figure out what's going on. But as the story progresses and her relationship with Anna, the young girl, as that develops, it kind of changes her perception of everything. So she's able to kind of leave her hardened exterior behind to help Anna and help protect her. I also love the various conflicts and juxtapositions that come up in this book. I really love the images of Lib eating and Anna not, and especially when it's put into the larger context of just after the famine. So that really adds a unique layer to the story of like eating and availability of food and choosing not to eat. We also see Lib, who is an independent woman struggling with the conservative religious beliefs of this town and this like misogynistic culture. We also see her scientific training clashing with religious ideologies and taking things on faith and things like that. So I really loved all of these juxtapositions kind of playing off each other and how it's reframed into the health and safety of this young woman. I gave The Wonder by Emma Donoghue 4.5 out of 5 stars. I highly recommend it. I also recently saw the film and I thought it was a wonderful adaptation, so highly recommend that as well. Next, I read Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie. For the past 2 years, I've slowly been working my way through Agatha Christie, although I've been more focused on the Poirot side of things. So this is my first novel with Miss Marple, and I believe it is the first first book in the Miss Marple series. So as the title suggests, there is a murder of a prominent figure in their community. He is a wealthy colonel, but he's very abrasive. So the first scene is everyone talking about how much they hate him. Once murdered, we follow several members of the community as everyone tries to figure out what happened. So Miss Marple isn't an investigator of great renown like Poirot. She is simply a member of this community. She kind of goes about making house calls and talking to people and kind of figuring out in her own way what happened, quietly putting together a list of suspects and a timeline of events. There are several twists and turns. There are unrelated events, red herring, although I felt the explanation at the end was a little bit mediocre. When I've read previous Christie novels, several of them were pleasantly unique, with twists that blended into the story. It was a lot more seamless. In this story, some of these unrelated events are just kind of there with no real reason. They didn't really add to the story except to create more chaos, and I felt unnecessarily draw out the timeline. It's already a fairly thin novel, and then to have half of it be unnecessary, it's just kind of eh. I found myself a little annoyed at all the little gossip between the townspeople, but this is kind of apropos to a critique of small town gossip and small towns trying to do their own thing and figure it out on their own, attempting to take matters into their own hands. So it made reading a little bit tedious and frustrating because I was just stop, you don't know what's going on. I'm unsure at this point if I'm going to read more in the Miss Marple series, although there are some Poirot stories that I kind of felt similar about, and I'm still reading those. So regardless of this book, I adore Agatha Christie. I'll continue reading more of her books in the future, but for Murder at the Vicarage, I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. The next book is Women Talking by Miriam Towse. You've probably heard a lot about this story because it was recently adapted into a film, and it did receive quite a bit of nominations and I believe a few awards as well. So Women Talking follows a group of women in a highly secluded religious community. Now they're discussing how to move forward after a string of rapes were committed by several men in their community. The women are unable to read or write. They have a very limited education outside of their household duties. The women are meeting in a barn to discuss their options, which are do nothing, stay and fight, or leave. The book is told from the perspective of August, who is the community's school teacher. He has been recruited to record the minutes of each of these meetings. With some commentary by the narrator, we see the women discuss major themes. These are interpretation of religious values, gender roles and their responsibilities as women and mothers, nature versus nurture and the effects those have on eventual decisions, responses to trauma and PTSD, leaving behind a safe life for something completely alien and unknown. I loved every minute of this book. While the organization as minutes from a meeting, a bit jarring to read, it adds to the tension and the undercurrent of panic that permeates the situation. The struggle to be logical while dealing with so many intense emotions and trying to make the right decision when you feel like you can't even make your next decision of what you're gonna do in your day-to-day is really palpable to me. It speaks to the struggle that a lot of us who have faced trauma deal with in making their day-to-day decisions in their everyday life, much less these women who are trying to make a life-altering decision. I think this book is a great commentary on the social structures that we depend on. What happens when our comfortable ignorance is turned upside down? And then we have to look at a new way of living and moving forward. Sometimes it was a little bit frustrating listening to arguments and things like that and listening to tangents. It was very realistic, but it was kind of you guys stay on topic. So I gave Women Talking 4.5 out of 5 stars. Highly recommend it. So I think by the time I got to this next book, the 2nd season of The Legend of Vox Machina was released on Amazon Prime, which is why I decided to read it. This is a graphic novel and it's Critical Role, The Legend of Vox Machina Origins, Volume 1. If you're familiar with Critical Role, it is a show here on YouTube centered on Dungeons & Dragons. Their first campaign follows Vox Machina, which is a party of adventurers, and they go through all of these adventures and travel and fight various foes. This graphic novel is the origin of how this group came together. I really feel like it would be kind of difficult, but not impossible, to jump into their story without like at least seeing the show, just because I felt like reading the graphic novel, it really added to my sense of the characters. Like I can hear Grog's voice in my head, and I can see Vex and how she stands and rolls her eyes and things like that. It's a fun little adventure seeing how they all kind of came together. And this is from someone who has not even listened to the whole campaign, just seen the show. I've listened to some of the campaign. So I did give it 3 stars, and I plan to keep reading and watching and listening. So staying on the D&D theme, I found this book in the airport because our flight was delayed coming back from Christmas, so I had a little time to browse. Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. The best way I can describe this book is like a Hallmark movie, but make it D&D. So Legends and Lattes follows Viv. She is an orc who has given up adventuring to pursue her dream of opening a coffee shop. Along the way, she meets a bunch of friends, she finds love, and finally puts roots down in a community, willing to accept her and her newfangled wares. But when old foes threaten the shop, Viv has to choose between this new community and her old fighting ways. Like I said, it's very much a Hallmark movie, but I honestly didn't mind it. It was fun and light and refreshing, especially after everything I had read so far, which is mainly like murder mysteries. The writing wasn't anything groundbreaking. The story moved at a good pace. I enjoyed all of the descriptions, and anything scores a plus in my book if it can make me crave the thing that it's talking about. So I really wanted like a good latte and a pastry while I was reading. I gave Legends and Lattes 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next, I had a little bit of a craving to continue this like escapism arc. So I decided to start the arduous task of reading the Song of Ice and Fire series. Historically, I struggle with series just because it is a commitment. I worry that if I take too long of a break in between books, I'm gonna forget what's going on. I am worried that I'm gonna forget things because there is like a lot going on in a lot of these series, and I'm worried I'm gonna forget like a character or forget a backstory or things like that. But I also get frustrated because there are books that come up that I want to read, and so I think I've kind of struck a good balance of like reading a book in a series, reading a couple books, and then going on to the next one in the series. So the next book I read was Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. Probably everyone and their mother knows the story. I actually hadn't watched the show at all prior to this, so I was pretty in the dark about the story. The book's organization follows a whole bunch of different people and their points of view, so your narrator changes from chapter to chapter. So there was a lot of jumping around, but it did seem like the best way to tell this huge story and keep the action moving at a decent pace. I really enjoy Martin's writing style. It's simultaneously immersive and sumptuous, but not drawn out and long-winded in most cases. Some of his turns of phrase are really lovely, and it made the whole experience of reading this first volume really enjoyable. Although I tend to like the beginnings a lot more in general, but I just love meeting the characters and kind of seeing how they are in the beginning, seeing how they tend to react to different experiences, how they handle different situations. He does a really good job of establishing all of these bonds without making it a great task of keeping everything straight. So I took a break between this one and A Clash of Kings, but I'll just talk about A Clash of Kings now. That's the second novel. I anticipate this volume being my least favorite. I think this is a personal issue just because the bulk of it is around war strategy. So I know this is important to the story, it just doesn't engage me personally. I enjoyed the first book because there was a lot of talk about what had happened instead of all the talk about strategizing and then it happening and then talking about it after. It was just a lot, but I know it was really important to the story. It just felt like it dragged out a little bit to me. I read that one slower than the first one just because it was like, I wanted to get to the next thing. So that's strictly a subject issue for me personally, not a writing issue. I really enjoy Arya and Jon and Sansa's arcs, and I really felt like I was trying to read through all of the war strategizing just to get to their part. I also really enjoyed that it leaned heavily on Tyrion as his point of view because I think his was an interesting like story arc throughout that book, and I'm very curious to see where it goes. I'm really excited to see what happens as all these various war parties are kind of cut down in number, and everyone more or less at the end of A Clash of Kings is kind of in limbo. So I gave A Game of Thrones 5 stars and A Clash of Kings 3 stars. So in between these two novels, I took a sharp left out of that topic. I read Gorillas in the Mist by Dian Fossey. So this is a memoir essentially of Fossey's lifetime spent studying the mountain gorillas in Africa. So it begins begins with Fosse's desire to study these gorillas and all of the various hurdles and things she had to go through to even get there. And then once established in her camp, it follows her time researching all of these different groups that she follows throughout the mountain terrain. So we see her learn more about their mannerisms, their behavior, their social hierarchy, their eating patterns, their mating patterns. It also chronicles her struggles against poachers, which ends up decimating an entire group in her research field. Unfortunately, Fosse was killed during her time there at her research camp, and it is a murder that still remains unsolved to this day. The book was written in her own words. It is a vibrant, passionate, and vulnerable account of this woman's devotion and dedication to the preservation and conservation of Africa and its gorillas. Because of Fosse's work, the mountain gorilla population has significantly recovered from what it was during her time there, and research continues at her camp to this day. I absolutely love this book. I gave it 5 stars. One day I hope to visit her research camp there. I also highly recommend the documentary on National Geographic called Secrets in the Mist. It really talks about Fosse and her work, but also just who she was as a person. And then it goes into more about the investigation surrounding her murder. So if you want a good follow-up to this book, I highly recommend that one. On the topic of gorillas, the next book I read was King Kong by Delos W. Lovelace, Edgar Wallace, and Marion C. Cooper. This is a story that was actually written as an adaptation from the original 1930s film King Kong. So in my edition, the introduction talks a lot about the history of the making of the film and about the writers, specifically Marion Cooper, and all of his time adventuring and how he came up with the idea. So I really liked that little bit of film history. The novel itself is quite short. Even though it's quick and short, it didn't lose a lot in terms of description and scene setting. Things like the native village and the wall and King Kong himself, were really well described, and I could see them in my mind. And I didn't watch the 1930s King Kong before I read this book, so it did really give me this like immersive feeling, which I really enjoyed. The writing style was a little bit kitschy. Like I could hear in my mind the people speaking like they're in an old noir film. Very exaggerated 1930s, you know, diction. But it was still a quick, fun adventure read. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. So after I finished this book, I did watch the 1930s version and the 2005 version with Jack Black and Naomi Watts. Obviously, the 2005 version is miles ahead of the 1930s one. I really did enjoy it, although they did change the story, which I am like historically against, but it was very good. And the 1930s version, especially after having the introduction to talk more about the stop motion effects that they used, it really wasn't that bad. Like I was expecting it to feel worse just watching it, but I thought it was pretty decent, and it's a really great story, and I think it's interesting to read that back to back with Dian Fossey's book. But it was just kind of a fun little rabbit hole I went down. Okay, so we already talked about Clash of Kings. So after A Clash of Kings, I read The Retreat by Sarah Pearse. I didn't realize that Sarah Pearse's 2 books were a series, so I actually read them backwards. So Retreat is actually the 2nd book in the series. So this follows a family and their significant others as they leave for a remote island in a luxury retreat. The island has a dark history, but the developers are trying to kind of rebrand it as this, you know, luxury vacation spot. But when someone is found murdered on the cliffs, Detective Ellen Wagner is called in to investigate, and things kind of go crazy from there. So the next book that I read, which is actually the first in the series, The Sanatorium, follows Ellen to a remote luxury hotel in the Swiss Alps. She is meeting her brother and his fiance for an engagement celebration when a storm hits, someone goes missing, and someone is found murdered. Soon Ellen is working around the clock against the weather and all on her own to discover what is going on here. So just describing these 2 back to back, it shows one of the really small annoyances I have at this point with Pearse, which is that these books, their settings are like essentially the same. All of the characters describe both of these places the same. Something's wrong. There's an evil here. So I wonder if this is going to continue in the next book and we're just going to find another weird evil place with a dark history. I don't know if I'm going to read it if that is the case, because it is just kind of annoying to me. Another little annoyance to me is that almost every character has experienced some kind of loss within the last year. So it seems a little on the nose to me, like, is anyone like normal here? The motives also fall a little short for me. They are plausible, and I think the motive in the sanatorium is a little more, it's a little bit better of a motive. Like, I can feel more emotion and things like that coming from that person than in the retreat. But I mean, I can get on board with a motive in both of them. But who am I to explain what people do and why they do it? So that's true to life, I suppose. That being said, I really enjoyed the retreat more than the sanatorium for its murder mystery. There are a lot of twists and turns. The writing's really quick. Action keeps moving at a good pace. There's also, I really enjoyed in the retreat, there are more changes of narrator and points of view than versus the sanatorium, which is just from Ellen's point of view. The main thing through both of them that I really enjoyed is Ellen's character development. I really think she's an interesting character, and she speaks a lot about a private case that has placed her on leave from her job as a detective. And I think depending on the setting, this would be the main reason that I would read more in this series, just because I want to know more about her past and this like mysterious person who is kind of haunting her. I also relate to a lot of her feelings of inadequacy and also her struggling to act logically when her anxiety and emotions are really running high. So I gave both The Retreat and The Sanatorium 4 stars. So those were all the books I read in the first half of 2023. Currently, I have moved on to the third book in the Song of Ice and Fire series, which is A Storm of Swords. I am also in the background reading The First Great Race by Dan Seavey, which is the book I mentioned in my Alaska video, all about the history of the modern Iditarod. Kind of going back and forth, but mostly focusing on A Storm of Swords to kind of get along in the series, but I'm enjoying it so far. So let me know about the books you guys are reading this year. I'd love to kind of hear what you're reading and what you think. Obviously my to read list is exponentially growing forever, so I'd love to just keep adding to it. And then let me know what you thought of these books. I'm probably going to do a more in-depth review of A Song of Ice and Fire as a whole. Hopefully I finish it this year. That's my goal. We will see. And then let me know if you have any other questions or anything like that. Geek out with me down below, and I will leave my Goodreads profile if you want to come follow me and see basically my pattern of reading. Lately it's been mostly murder mysteries and fantasy, so if you're into those things, come along for the journey. Other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.